So thank you all so much for your time and your attention. I really appreciate this. And Gabe, thank you for putting this together. Let me kind of give you a little context about who I am, what I do before I start the presentation, and kind of how I know all of these people. So the people that we're on the line with, we all are McNair scholars. And so that is a TRIO program, and I think it's still in existence. But what it is, it's a program that promotes PhDs for first generation college students. It was a wonderful program. We learned a lot about research at that time as undergrads. And it's probably one of the best times of my life. And these individuals are lifelong friends. So I'm really happy to share this time with these people because they are amazing and they always have excellent advice. And I look forward to hopefully sharing more of these things. So thank you again for your time. What I currently do is I work at Valparaiso University. I'm the Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Communication. So what I'm going to talk about today is really focusing on things from a communication standpoint. I know we're talking about recentering pedagogy. So I took a piece from one of the articles that so it's still, I just submitted the article. So hopefully it will get submitted, but I mean, it will get approved. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about here really has to do with that. And then it also has to do with some things and activities that I have in my own classroom. So I hope that it is really helpful for all of you. I really like the oral tradition. So I am not gonna share a PowerPoint presentation. But I will share my PowerPoint later if people want to see it and if you want to know where I'm getting this information and you want to check your references. So in the oral tradition, I will not be sharing my PowerPoint. But let me go ahead and start. A lot of the text that I'm talking about comes from this handbook. It's called the Handbook for Intercultural Communication. So I will be reading from that. So let me go ahead and start. So the name, we said, what is your worldview, right? And so this is just a presentation that focuses on how are we going to really change some pedagogy and our pedagogy strategies. So let me start off with this quote. The purpose of theorizing is not to enhance one's intellectual or academic reputation, but to enable us to grasp an understanding and explain, to produce a more adequate knowledge, the historical world and its process, thereby to inform our practices so that we may transform it. So I start with this quote because I think it allows us to think about the implications behind theory and worldview, and that's what we're talking about today. Oftentimes as teachers and academics, we want to discuss theory and method, but we don't necessarily grapple with the power and assume naturalness of thought, right? So we are, when we put information out there, we're like, oh, it's so natural. Everyone knows this. We often assume everyone thinks like this. We're put in institutions that naturalize these very thoughts while the people in power are collecting those checks. And all of us know they are collecting those checks. So as a college professor, I hear this assumed generalization of thought all the time, with comments like, everybody knows that, or I just had a normal Thanksgiving. And then when I hear this kind of things from my students, I always say, well, what is normal? Why is it normal? Why do you look at the world through this particular lens? And with these questions as a primer, I want you to think about your own worldview. So what is your worldview? Scholars will say that a worldview is the creation of a worldview is the work of a generation rather than an individual. But each of us, for better or worse, are a part of creating a worldview. This concept we discussed in the earlier discussion when we think about the ideas of what a worldview, but I wanted to I'm sure you've heard about what a worldview is. You've heard it many, many, many a times, but I wanted to give you like kind of a definition, a working definition of what it is, right? So essentially it is shared meaning, shared experiences. And sometimes we really naturalize those experiences. But why am I talking about this? I'm talking to a bunch of teachers. Why is this significant? And we know that it's significant because there's implications for teaching, right? We are part of institutions and we're bound by rules of a textbook. And I looked at some of the earlier discussions that you had, and Gabe sent me some of the resources, and people kind of talked about this, right? When we think about what a textbook actually does, who controls that textbook, who controls that narrative, right? And how that narrative shapes our worldview. It highlights the political, the social, and the racial implications that institutions create. But I think it's our job as teachers to challenge that, right? We have to ask our question, what type of knowledge are we recreating? What language are we using to tell the narrative of history? And how can you engage people in the outside community to tell narratives that are counter to what is going on in a textbook? And we have a huge responsibility as teachers to do that, because think about how impressionable young minds are. We help the institutions, we help shape worldviews, we determine what truth is, right? These are things that are consciously or unconsciously spoken within the context of the classroom. What are good sources of knowledge? I mean, we hear this all the time, don't go to Wikipedia. That's not a good source of knowledge. You have to check your facts. These are things that teachers say all the time. They're like, maybe you can start there, but that's not where you get your knowledge. And you have to think about, well, where are we getting our knowledge? And how are we transmitting these messages to our students? And then what is our responsibility to other people's? What is really our responsibility as teachers? And that's why worldview and questioning your own worldview is essential to effective teaching. So with this in mind, I really want you all to think about this concept of recentering a worldview. And I think that recentering a worldview is vital because it moves beyond old notions of diversity. Because what I say is diversity in the sense of when we think about is just a Band-Aid. It's a Band-Aid to a systemic issue, and it produces anti-racist knowledge. So that's why I want you to really think about how can you recenter yourself? How can you recenter things in your classroom to make it relevant? So let me go ahead and read a quote about centralization. So it says, the centralization of knowledge is specific places as spatially articulated of power, where the organizations of knowledge is inscribed to a geopolitical space, Western Europe, which then obscures the possibilities of even thinking or conceptualizing the disturbance of knowledge from other histories. So it's essentially when we're just teaching from a textbook, we know that it has that Eurocentric standpoint, right? And we know that it decenters people and it puts individuals in the margins. And so with this, I want us to think about recentering and placing our students first. And this is how we can do it. Now, there's many ways to look at things, but I'm going to outline 3. I'm going to talk about this concept of Eurocentrism and Eurocentricity. I'm also going to talk about Afrocentricity and Asian centricity. I'm not going to get into the deep theory because I only have 10 minutes, but I want you to really critically think about how you can recenter your teaching and what that means. So Eurocentrism and Eurocentricity. So Eurocentrism is that universal ideology. It goes back to that notion of the worldview that we were talking about earlier. The approach to the non-Western world and non-Westerners, right? So that's what Eurocentrism is. So when we think about, the Greeks this is how we do things, right? This is how we have created knowledge. But Eurocentricity actually refers to something different. It refers to placing this notion of Europe at the center. Unfortunately, that usually is the default within the context of education, because even though we talk about centering Europe, it becomes Eurocentrism and it becomes ethnocentrism, because we're like, here are where the standards are. This is how we are judging our students. This is the information that we're telling it. It's because it's a policy. It's because the school told us that we have to do it. You know, this is, as teachers, it's a really hard thing, because how are you grappling with what what the person in charge wants you to do versus really giving a fair and equitable education? So we want to avoid this, you know, Eurocentricity and this Eurocentrism. I want you to really think about the first concept here, and I'm sure that you might have heard about this concept of Afrocentricity, and it's from Malefi Asante. He is a communication scholar, by the way. And fun fact, my colleague, he was actually on my colleague's dissertation. So we have a close relationship. And if you guys know How to Be an Anti-Racist, that text is coming out by Ibram Kendi, he was actually one of Asante's students. So fun fact. But Afrocentricity is these theoretical notions that insist on viewing people from Africa with not as subjects, but rather as objects. So really what we're saying is, where is the center of the world? And in a really good example here, if we wanted to look at the world from an Afrocentric standpoint, and we wanted to talk about this with our students, instead of starting with chattel slavery in our classrooms, because often that is what it is told in the textbooks, right? Why don't we think about what happened in Africa? Because if we know these are the oldest civilizations, right? And these are things I know for myself, I was never taught. So how do we give different narratives as teachers, finding that information, changing our students' worldviews about social studies, right? And the history that we give. So that's Afrocentricity. Now, Asian centricity is placing Asia at the center of the world. And this theory actually came from Mieke. And in his theory, he's also a communication theorist. So the Asian centricity came from Afrocentricity in a sense, right? So it was born out of that as a theoretical concept. And it's really, again, that notion of recentering Asian culture, traditions, and theories in research, rather than just comparing them. And I really want everyone to think about this. When you think about these concepts, right? I know there's international pedagogy, there's intercultural pedagogy, there's a lot of things. But I really want you to think about going beyond the comparative when you are talking about these things within your classroom. I think that the most important thing is to center where your students' culture is, whatever that might be. It might be Latinx, it might be African American, indigenous people, they might come from China, wherever they're from. I really want you to think about, how can you center that? How can you let students have agency over that lesson so they feel empowered? Because that's the most important thing, and that's why the centricity is important. But I caution you on the comparative, like I said, because if you're just comparing, maybe you're saying this is good and this is bad, but in actuality, nothing is good and nothing is bad. It just is, and it is a way of thinking, right? You don't have a bad worldview. It just is, right? It comes from your cultural roots. That's why you see the world the way you do. So move beyond that, I guess, as a teacher. So one activity that I'd like to share with all of you that I do in my class is I talk about the powerful effects of language and culture, and then I discuss what is Eurocentrism, what is Asian centrism, and what is Afrocentric. What are these worldviews? Like, how do they see the world? And of course, we're not going to get into huge theories, but I think the best way to represent this is, I know, for example, in China, when I lived in China, you know how in the United States, if you look at the map, we're at that center, right? If you go to China and you get that map, they're at the center, right? And the whole world is around them. That's where they think that's where the development comes from. So I think visually it'd be interesting to have those different maps that are different centrisms. And after you discuss this, I would assign homework. And the homework that I would assign here is I would ask them to find a song that represents a historic moment and your cultural worldview. Students love this. In my classes, I have so much fun because there's many reasons why we do this. It gives them agency as a homework assignment, and music is always a great expression of what culture is, right? And to help give them a sense of what it is, I actually provide them with a list, and I can send that list out. I actually got this activity and I changed it a little bit from the National Communication Association with gifts, but it's just, what are some historical songs and why is this important? And there's also a website that you can reference if you're going to give this lesson. It's called Song Facts, and it talks about why a song is important, right? And the song itself really resonates. It's a powerful medium to, you know, explore history, to see how it is, and then gives the students agency. So that's all I have for you. Thank you for your time, and I am going to give the floor to Liz. Thank you.
Is this working? This is my first Zoom presentation, so I don't even know how this actually works. Can everybody hear me okay?
You're good.
Okay, perfect. My name is Lizzie Silva Gomes, and I'm doing a presentation today on cultural wealth, and it's really an extension of a lot of things that Dr. Bell had just spoken about. And I just want to thank everyone for being here, listening, taking the time to be open to some things which may be new ideas and some things which you probably already know. And I really love and adore all the people organizing this panel from McNair days till now, just doing amazing work. I did a keynote presentation, so I'm gonna try this. Again, I'm totally new to this. Hopefully this works. I'm gonna hit this share screen button. Is this, okay, wait, ooh. Can you guys see this? Is this okay? Okay, perfect. And let me get into play mode. Okay. So again, my name is Lizzie, confusing Portuguese spelling of it, but think L-I-Z-Z-I-E. And I'm going to talk about exploring cultural wealth and how racist narratives undermine empowerment, and just a little bit about strategies for teachers and methods for the classroom, right? So this is kind of a call in to educators that we can all build awareness around these issues. One is narratives, and that includes the nomenclature we use, just consciously or unconsciously, as well as the content. Usually that means very pre-planned curriculum, overt and covert messaging. And then the next one is whitewashed, skewed, erased histories that are often present in the curriculum. Another is exploitation of creativity and cultural wealth and how it perpetuates inequality. And then also talk about a few anti-racist approaches. As Dr. Bell mentioned, How to Be an Anti-Racist is a great book for references. And I just want to briefly at the end touch on like approaches, because once we've identified the problem, then it becomes very, at least to me, like disconcerting when we don't have solution-oriented thinking to address that, right? The first point is language as a vehicle for socialization. So my background is in sociology. I'm an artist that works in fiber, but then I've gone on to incorporate my sociology background in the creative world to be someone with the platform speaking about creative integrity and creating a community-grounded art practice. And so this is an example of me really drawing on my sociology roots to kind of pull this into creativity and cultural wealth. Socialization starts in early childhood, as we know, it's earliest moments that you're alive. It really starts rolling, and it continues on through development into adulthood. And it's basically society replicating itself, right? Because a socialized adult will go on to continue with the worldview that it was taught and to support the policies that already exist, to support the status quo, to go on reinforcing and replicating the system as it exists, right? So there's a lot at stake for you as an educator to think critically about socialization and how that is a part of your classroom, because it absolutely is a part. Considering there's two different ways of socialization, some are overt, and the school is an institution that is part of overt socialization. And one very tangible example is like the Pledge of Allegiance, where children are reciting these words that literally represent the ideologies of the United States. And it's almost like an absorption process, right? But covert, unintentional and more subtle messaging happens often unconsciously in the classroom, in the family structure, and by the media. An example would be a child watching advertisements, television, movies, and maybe not even consciously, but definitely subconsciously picking up on noticing similar complexions, similar hair textures, similar ways of speech, or speech patterns, similar all kinds of patterns are picking up on who is being featured, right, in the media. And this conveys to them who is desirable, who is valued, who is important, and who is praised, who is celebrated. And so as we become an adult, we have an opportunity to really reflect and critique, and we're kind of always in process internally with our socialization from our childhood, the experiences we're constantly building, unlearning, which is kind of like reflecting on some things we were taught and have learned that we feel might not be relevant or might be false. And then intaking information from other people, other sources, experts, for example, or trusted people who are authorities, friends, family members, people who we value their information. And so kind of in the mix and in the middle is curiosity, reflection, introspection, listening, empathy, critique. And all of this is kind of going on within us, and we're reflecting and having opportunities to unlearn certain things we were socialized with or have assumed about the world. In the classroom, there is a real need to bring humanity and individuality and agency to Black and Indigenous people. And one way to do that is to consider, they're almost in history books as characters, a lot of historical figures in general, but often Black and Indigenous people are monolithic. They're not viewed as individuals. And if you reconceptualize as a teacher in the classroom, thinking of those people as ancestors when you're talking about them. For example, if you have students in the classroom, a student that is African American, and you're speaking of slaves, really reconceptualize that and think about you're speaking about that person's great-great-grandfather or great-great-great-great-grandfather. You know, it really changes the view to put that human lens on things. And so as people like to think it's superficial that we change our words, words are really conveying a lot about ideology and value. So slave is a very dismissive term, and to change that and really discuss people as mothers who were enslaved, people who were enslaved, rather than slaves, which almost sounds like a predestined thing. It sounds like something that is something people should not escape. It almost sounds like a caste that is just unavoidable. And we want to avoid speaking about humans in that kind of dismissive language. A lot of historical narratives we teach children, especially starting in elementary school, which are very romanticized versions of the slavery era, include really disturbing things when you think about the coded language here, like mistress and concubine, when this woman is actually a victim of trafficking and sexual assault. Discussing people being born a slave, again, that's almost like a inevitable predestined kind of distinction. To talk about quote unquote slave masters disciplining slaves, which is really coded language for torture, abuse. Trading really is human trafficking. So let's be honest and real about what we're really talking about, and not use whitewash language to cover up painful events, and also to create this sense of inevitability and inescapability about it. In terms of talking about culture and art, there are a lot of terminology that slip into our language that we really need to become aware of. There's this thing of talking about all art that is especially pre-colonial indigenous African art as primitive, childlike, naive. It's really demeaning, really degrading. And we constantly, as Dr. Bell said, are referencing the European standard through subtle language choices like classical. She's a classical beauty, which really means European, right? It's a European traditional cultural standard of beauty. And even the word culture can mean, you know, high culture, quote unquote, which is a wealthy European view of what culture is, right? So challenging some of the canons: who is the audience? Who is the judge? What is the criteria? This is just an example here. Picasso's work, how it's characterized as groundbreaking, genius, innovative, and you can literally put side by sides there with African masks, so you can see that the mask is so similar, but it's described in completely different terms that are degrading and remove the humanity. And we also don't know the individual who made the mask. They're often just cast as African, which is such a broad designation, not even the nationality or the specific community or culture in which they come from, let alone the individual. So again, thinking of this idea of discussing Black and brown people as monoliths in the most mass quantity versus Europeans as individuals. What is cultural literacy? And that's something that's really important to think about as an educator, that you cannot speak about issues without having culture embedded within them, right? Cultural literacy is key for you to be able to communicate, but how broad your cultural understanding is, really we have to redefine and rethink about what is cultural literacy, right? Conventionally in the classroom, it means literacy, an understanding of European culture only, right? So we really need to broaden what that means. Cultural wealth is something we need to bring into the classroom as a concept. Cultural wealth is often not backed by financial wealth. But it's really the most valuable people to humanity, or valuable things to humanity, because how do people want to spend their free time? That really determines what they deem as truly valuable, right? So when people have free time, they go to see movies, plays, they want to listen to music, they want to look at art, they want to think about style, fashion, all of these kind of subjective kind of artistic forms of currency in our culture, which are, they are monetized in certain ways, and we have to consider who's earning money off of them, right? A lot of the online platforms that are monetizing viral dances and viral music and things like that, that are created in a large part by African American, Black youth around the world. Latin youth are being co-opted and monetized for the financial gain of predominantly white institutions, billionaires, and a small group of wealthy people around the world. And I love this definition here by Yoso in 2005. Defined community cultural wealth as an array of knowledges, skills, abilities, and contacts possessed and used by communities of color to survive and resist racism and other forms of oppression. So it's really this sense of culture and why it is so, why some of the most oppressed cultures are so wealthy with riches of arts, music, dance, is it has become a form of therapy, a form of community connection in cultures that were deeply oppressed. And as you can see by this image here, the roots of music, you can see pretty much every popular music that is like the top genres in the world stem from Black/African American traditions. And so we have to think, who is earning money off of these industries? Hollywood, music industry. This is cultural theft. And it's set up that way through gatekeeping institutions. And there's also very tangible instances of theft too, through museums. A lot of European and American museums have indigenous and African artifacts that were quite literally stolen from sacred sites. And these are funding these institutions. They're a draw for people to come look and pay money to enter the museum. Right here, there's just the image of all of these things I just gathered within like 5 minutes online of different appropriations that are where is the money going, basically? You have things like slang, you have things like dream catchers, you know, concepts like spirit animal, costuming, dance classes, celebrity aesthetics. You have Coachella kind of music festivals, all of this money being earned off cultural wealth that is not, the people earning the money are not part of the cultures that have created these concepts. So as an educator, really be aware of certain periods of history that are commonly instructed in schools and are commonly whitewashed. For example, colonial era America, so it's just pervasively whitewashed in American education. I remember learning about cute stories like George Washington's dentures, only to find out later that he had the first pair of dentures. They were forcibly, they were teeth forcibly taken from a man's mouth to create his dentures. And this is an era pre, you know, any kind of anesthesia, any kind of, you know, you think about the horror of that, and we're whitewashing that story and we're telling it to children. What does that do? Why? What is that for? You know, we have to ask about some of these things. The Confederate flag that's even shown in textbooks is not the actual Confederate flag. It's a specific battle flag to a specific battle, specific place during the Civil War. It was never a Confederate flag, but we're romanticizing a lot of this stuff for the education system. So the process, okay, now we're in the solution phase, which is the process to deconstruct and critique all of this. And I really encourage instructors not only to ask these questions within themselves as they're going through curriculum, but also to introduce some of these topics as dialogue in the classroom, right? Whose intellectual property is this? Where did it originate? Who's being celebrated here? And to really note some key ways Black and Indigenous communities are systematically disenfranchised from their cultural wealth is really important. How do we devalue Black and Brown cultural innovations? How do gatekeeping institutions separate the community from even being able to benefit or view the culture? To have stolen artifacts from sites, place them in museums that charge expensive fees that community members whose ancestors may have even made the pieces, they can't afford to go view that. That is a problem. And strategies that we can discuss as educators include, again, humanizing historical events, avoiding monolithic approaches, really changing our language, encouraging dialogue, encouraging reflection and critique, proper citation and attribution of sources and of cultural innovations. And some suggested assignments, really asking your students to reflect and critique in various ways on their own place in the system, their own place in the cultural activities they enjoy, and who's paying for that, where does the money go, and how involved in those communities that actually created those cultural activities that they enjoy. Are they giving back? Is money going to those communities? And then also really exploring more research into some of the ethnic and subcultural roots of some things we take for granted that have just become mainstream now. like tattooing and car culture. The tartan fabric is a really, really interesting thing to learn about. Scottish Highland culture as an oppressed people. It's fascinating the amount of things around the world that have these deep roots that we don't know, have taken for granted just because they have entered the mainstream. And that's it. Thank you so much. I'm gonna pass it on to Dr. Mozilla Kazikone.
Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It is really wonderful to see you all, so many colleagues and friends and folks I don't know. Hopefully we will continue on in a community like this. It is really special to be in this presentation and to have it be more than 15 years in the making with my colleagues here. We are all proud to have been a part of the McNair Scholars Program and the connections it did for us, the learning that it encouraged for us, and as you can see, the community that it created for us, you know, well over 15 years ago that we still share in today. So what I'd like to do today is talk to you about a teaching tool that I've been using for a while in the classroom called Zines. Okay, so Zines as a creative teaching tool. So what even is a zine? A zine is commonly a small circulation of self-published work of original or appropriated text and images, usually reproduced from the photocopier. And they're usually the product of either one person or a small group of people. Zines can also be created digitally. So I know that there's some online programs for trying to kind of create a format that exists online for zine creation. But what I've focused on in my own work thus far has mainly been tangible paper copies of zines. So as you can see, proud students, and I'm a proud professor, and I should say I'm a proud professor of College of the Desert, and so glad to see so many of my colleagues here on the call. So as you can see in these images, zines look so different. You know, there's really no two that are the same, and that is part of what is so amazing about them as a teaching tool and as a space for students to develop their own creativity, vision, artistic vision, as well as you know, the expression of the academics that they have engaged in and participated in over the course of the semester or the quarter. So I just wanted to give like a very brief background. So when we think about contemporary zines, we need to ground it in it coming out of a heterogeneous history. They emerge out of alternative press, the feminist movement. And when we talk about it, often from like a mainstream, or perhaps as Dr. Bell had mentioned, our Eurocentric perspective, from a white viewpoint, zines have three major moments of publishing. Excuse me. Okay. So the first moment comes out of fan magazines out of the 1930s from science fiction fans. Fan fiction still exists to this day, but this is kind of one of these, origin stories. Two, coming out of the punk movement, simultaneous punk movement, and also, development of, accessible photocopiers in the 1970s as central to developing, and not only developing the zine, but being able to copy it and produce it more. I mean, they're usually small, but you still, folks are sharing zines, mailing zines, and even a small run of zines, you need to have access to actually make copies of those and print those. And from the early 1990s and the Riot Girl movement, sometimes referred to as the third wave of feminism, emerging out of the alternative scene and punk music scene. So this is central. But what these moments obscure is that there have always been Black folks, people of color, Indigenous folks, Latinos, Chicanos, involved in zine making and production. So, Chicana zinester Bianca Ortiz, Pipiesta Samarachina, says, one can draw a history of zines that sees them as coming out of the Riot Girl, punk, and other usual and majorly white suspects. or look through an alternative lens that sees them equally birthed out of self-publication methods used by Chicana, Latina, Black, Indigenous, and Asian Pacific American artists, poets, and writers during the 1960s and 1970s, right? So by expanding the view, we see that, you know, we're not using zines or bringing zines to students of color, right? These originate in our stories as well. Okay, and as an example, so let me highlight for you. So these are some of the magazines produced by the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Just by seeing the cover, right, you can notice the use of collage right here on the left-hand side. You can use the work of art, which has been central to this production. This is the art of Emory Douglas. As central to kind of wedding that art, collage, you know, news, information, poetry, art in one space. Just to follow up with a few other examples here. We see on the right here is a zine, learning our own history is important. Brown berets against police brutality, self-determination for our people, right? So again, just to give you the visual, and I feel if we could be together, I would pass around zines to you because the visual and also the tangible matter of the zine is central. So they are a great teaching tool, but they're not just like fun or feisty materials. They advocate for rights. They highlight a political expression and spaces for political intervention. For those who make zines, they're confidence boosting. They can serve as a resistance tool, especially when we're thinking about the way that Lizzie was talking about in terms of cultural production, who kind of owns the means of this production. So when we think about that, we can also unpack that as it relates to the publishing world, right? Whether it be publishing books or publishing magazines, and the gatekeepers who might keep people out, right? So this serves as a method of subverting that by creating one's own materials, and it's a resistance tool. So I'm presenting this to you as a way to add zines to your toolkit of decolonial teaching. So you can create a do-it-yourself class collection. So I should say that when I have used zines in the classroom, not only is it an approach to get the students to produce this, their own magazine, their own zine, right? But I also am thinking of it, and based on whatever class it is that I'm teaching, as building a collection, right? Just like you have a collection of magazines or a collection of books that we as a class, as we go through this experience of the semester or the quarter together, whatever it is that we're learning, that we are going to build not only your zine, but collectively, everyone's zines make up this collection, okay? So that, I'll come back to that. So zines teach that critical thought and analysis, qualitative interview methods, cultural reviews, and art can all exist in the same place. And in that sense, it also serves as a decolonial teaching method, right? That centers, rather than makes on the periphery, the role of art, the role of interview, the role of qualitative research, as well as essay writing, as all center, right? Not just that art is a place only to be conducted in an art class or an art history class, right? It really tries to dispel that idea that art takes place over here and that like this critical written academia takes place over here, right? But recognizes that these are all creative, not only creative, but have a weight to them. And their role as a resistance tool, thinking through and practicing feminist and womanist and intersectional and decolonial classroom practices. They teach students how to engage with the world around us, and I'll unpack that for you a little bit more. Their political and cultural expression and intervention, and their project-based learning that boosts self-confidence. And all the zines that you see featured in my presentation here, these are all zines created by former students of mine. So as you see these, right, and you see how different they are, even looking on this slide here, from students deciding to use glossy paper, right, to, as you see, right, this looks like construction paper on the left-hand side. We see some hand drawing, right? One is not valued more than the other based on that, oh, you use glossy paper or where your staples are, right? The value is in the production of it, the process itself, regardless of the outcome. So zines are a space for critical reflection. They are a kind of informal pedagogical project, a kind of punk rock teaching machine. And they're projects that represent cultural production and cultural reflection. I've also used zines as a way to invite other people into the classroom. Zine makers, as featured in this photo, I've got 2 folks here who came and gave a talk in one of my classes who were part of a zine making collective known as the Thick Thigh Collective. They made and produced their own zines. I actually met them at a zine event and saw that they actually had made their own zines about teaching other folks how to make zines, right? So folks who are using this to, as artists, as zine makers, are also thinking about the implications of zines as teaching tools, which is why that I invited them and wanted to collaborate with them in the classroom. Okay. Using zines to decolonize education, there's value to students reaching out to people in their community. So based on the way that I have set up zines here, the students, they write essays, they conduct interviews, they create art, they do write a personal reflection about their experience in all of this. And for example, with having students conduct an interview with someone from their community, their family, right, we're expanding the touch points. What I mean by that is it's no longer just me in the classroom with my students, but rather it's me and the students, but the students also, that's, if I have 100 students, that's 100 additional touch points of students who are going out, conducting interviews, learning about their friends, their community members, their family members. I've had students come back to me shocked at, the stories that have come out of their family or who their family members knew. I had a student once who came back to me after having conducted an interview with their parent, only to learn that their parent was good friends with Diane Nash, a famous member of the civil rights movement. But when we value our community members, our families as holders of knowledge as well, and we value that, the students come back surprised at what they learn, and we also expand all of those points as valuable points of information, right? All of those community member points. So it values art and creativity within the production of the study of social sciences. It provides various tools for the students and space for community collaboration. Community collaboration, I think, is really important here. Like I mentioned, in working with the collective of zine makers, I have also worked with a number of librarians. I have always found that the best people to know on any campus are the librarians, hands down. And so in working with librarians on many campuses, and I've got 2 featured in my slides here, it does a number of things. One is that many people already have an existing interest in zines, right? You will find zines sometimes in libraries, public libraries, college and university libraries. So it's not necessarily new, and a lot of folks already, they've been developing a collection, or they make zines themselves or work with others to make zines. So I've worked to build alliances with librarians to not only bring them into the classroom as teachers to be another point of education for the students, right? We've also moved, to bring the students to the libraries, right? Whatever incentive we need to get students back into the libraries, not only as and to recognize the library not only as a space for holding books and text, right, but as a space where we go to produce. And I don't mean produce in the capitalist sense. I mean, we're learning ways of creating, I think would be better put. Okay? So we build faculty networks and push for new forms of knowledge. And what I have been really very proud of, particularly in the collaboration with librarians, is the ways in which we can collaborate to bring the zines into the library. So I've worked with a number of folks where after the end of the class and after we've created a whole collection of zines, we have given a copy of that collection, right? The students will make multiple copies. A copy of that collection has gone directly to the library, right? So that's another layer of a decolonial practice. What does it mean then to have students produce work that goes into the library, right? It's not like, 20 years from now, you write a book and it finally ends up there. But students, while they're students, creating and producing knowledge that will end up directly in that space. I think it helps shift our understanding of the library and helps to work to decolonize that space as a space for valuing student knowledge and training. So the outcome of this project is that it allows students to explore intersectionality. It challenges notions on acceptable works of products and production for students and for the classroom, right? It moves beyond, as the essay is the central masterpiece of classroom work. It doesn't cut that out completely, right? I think it's still important to know how to write and have arguments and so forth. That is a central piece, but it's not the only piece, okay? It gets students engaged with their local community, engages them with research, and engages with libraries. So as you see here, not only have we worked with libraries at colleges, at universities, but have reached out to other collections. So for example, this is a feminist library in Los Angeles. We communicated with them and brought a collection of zines to their library, right? So we're actually also disseminating the projects to our local community. In sum, zines and their transnational network, however dispersed and sometimes contradictory, provide, like the Riot Grrrl movement, a culturally productive, politicized counterpublic where people can experiment with ideas, articulate themselves, and describe experiences otherwise suppressed by mainstream society. So how to, in terms of thinking about this, if this is a tool you want to use for yourself, I mean, zine is ultimately, it's a do-it-yourself activity. Obviously, when it comes to being in the classroom, we're not just leaving the students on their own, right? We're helping to scaffold projects and giving them the tools to actually create the zine. There's no guidelines or rules on how to make a zine. There are so many different ways. But the emphasis is on the do-it-yourself part, that it's process-oriented, that it's non-hierarchical, right? Those are central. Many zines are black and white, although I have to say a lot of the zines, and I'll show you a few here, many have been in color. Students using everything from colored paper to construction paper to using their own art and drawing and design, even felt to make 3D design on their zines as well. So I've seen all different kinds of zines at this point. So my recommendation to you all, if you decide to do a project like this, is to scaffold your projects. When you first tell students and you show them examples of zines and you're like, you're going to create, you're going to create books, you're going to make these things, students might look at you like, I'm going to what? You want me to what? It can come off as a little bit intimidating. But to be honest, the way to take away that concern, nervousness, intimidation is just to scaffold the zine into smaller projects over the course of the semester or the quarter. So for example, this is pretty much the model that I use for the zines in the classroom, is I have students write one cultural commentary review. So what that is the students engage with an album, a documentary, a film, somehow related to the course of the class. I'm not picking that film, right? I've set up the class, right? They know the themes, and I tell them to find something based around these themes for them to review, right? So that ends up being another touch. If I have 100 students, I'm going to get maybe not 100 different cultural commentaries. I mean separate different unique pieces of culture, but at least 90, I tell you. So those are additional points. They conduct an interview. They write an essay. They have to create one curated art piece. So it could also be part of their cover, right? So use of collage, use of cut and paste, drawing, poetry, all of it's acceptable. So one curated art piece, of course, is related to the class. And really important, really central to, I think, really kind of solidify the learning, if you're using this in the classroom, is a personal reflection, right? So I set it up kind of broad, but the reflections tend to be about their experiences both in the classroom, their perceptions on making zines, what they got out of the experience. I mean, it really is I set it up where it's the last thing they write, so they do have the full class to reflect over and include that in their zine. And I include here a zine share. So what I mean by that is, while I have all these separate projects, right? And I should include this first. While I have all these separate projects, I am, as we go, teaching them about how to put them together. So if I'm doing that myself, or when I'm really lucky, when I have librarians or other artists come into the classroom to collaborate on the teaching about putting the project together. So when it comes down to it, the students realize that I've walked them throughout the course of the semester. I've gotten them through all the different pieces of their zine. We just get to the end where they actually have to compile and make it. And then we dedicate a class to a zine share, and we really just bring in our zines. The whole class is we're passing around zines. The students will have little pieces of paper to leave comments, comments about folks' zines. So then it's no longer just, again, it's not just the touch point of you turning your project to me, your professor, but rather you put in all this work and project, we're going to spend a whole class just sharing and commenting and providing feedback with each other. So the students will leave notes in the zine for their colleagues. And when they get their original zine back, they've got some feedback. So they won't just hear from me, they'll hear from some of their colleagues about the process of making the zine. And I just included this photo. This is from the first time that I used this project many, many years ago. And since this, I think my students have created, I think now between 600 and 700 zines. So it's been a really affirming project as a teacher. I have to say that as a student, I have so many countless examples of students coming up to me saying, I really didn't think I could do this. You know, it would have seemed so hard. It seemed so impossible. And that sense of being proud of themselves, from being able to learn from their community, valuing, you know, their parents, their siblings, you know, people come back knowing more about their families and their communities. And there's nothing quite like it. And, you know, we all know this as teachers, to see a student who's proud of themselves, who didn't think they could do it, and they came away and they, not only did they do it, but they always exceed their own expectations, very much so. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for the presentation. Thank you all three for the presentations. Now we're going to open up to the audience. Any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat feature. Annabelle Neary.
I was just really impressed with all three of your presentations. I'm a big fan of TRIO. I came from the TRIO programs, and I oversaw TRIO programs, and I'm really pleased to see what I consider the beautiful intellectual outcomes and the value of what we do in TRIO for first generation, low income, and students of color, and graduate students of color. So congratulations. Really impressed, and I look forward to hearing more from all of you considering our national climate.
Thank you.
And I want to give a shout out to my girl, Dr. Kane.
Thank you, Dr. Neary.
Any other questions?
Can I say one thing? Okay. I really appreciate how everything just worked together synchronously, if you think about it. Because I think that the way the presentations, and we didn't even look at each other's presentations. So a lot of the things that Dr. Kone and Lizzie that they were talking about, they really gave those real life examples when I was talking about the concept of recentering and how you could apply it to the classroom. And then you also, Dr. Kone, talked about this use of music and what that means to kind of recreating the culture. And essentially that decolonization that you're talking about is also that recentering, placing their narratives at the very heart of the conversation. And I really think that it's phenomenal. And Lizzie, I really appreciate those real life examples, because sometimes, as we know, when we deal with folks of color and indigenous folks, Black, brown folks, that, you know what, we are not being told those narratives, right? It's like, this is what it is. And we know for a fact it's not, right? Like our forefathers and the 4th of July, like this is such a great thing, but it's not. And how can we counter those and empower people? So I just wanted to say thank you both for such great work. And it was great working with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Kone, I do have a question. Thinking about the online world and considering that perhaps distance learning is going to come back, how would you apply zines in the distance learning world?
Okay, well, I've thought about this a bit. Part of what I would consider is looking into the online format of zine creation. So that's one way, and shareable way, that folks are kind of, you know, already online doing that. So I would look to those options. But I do have to say, even if folks are separate, you know, there's so much to be said by using, you know, pen and paper, using that, you know, even if we're apart, for them to, you know, be making collage, you know, cutting up stuff, glue sticks, you know, I remember I had students joke with me once, I think it was about 15 years ago, we were making collage in the classroom, and someone says, my parents would be so mad if they knew I was making, like, cutting and pasting in the classroom. And I just got such a chuckle out of it, because I think about how much I've continued to use that format. And it just seems like when you actually make it yourself, that there's just something else that's happening. There's some other magic going on. So I think that you can still do this project, a paper project from in a distance learning format. I imagine sharing it, you'd have to take pictures and, make a PDF of that to share it with your professors. But if your students have access to a printer, or they have access to just the paper, or any of those goods, then I think they can, make it at home. But I would also recommend that if you're still thinking about wanting just to do it online, there are online platforms for zine making. So either works, but even if we're apart from each other, getting the students to get out the glue, right, the glue sticks, and make that, I do think that you'll still get some benefit from that, even being apart.
I had a question related to that. I was just curious. It's so good to see you. Oh my gosh.
I'm so happy to see you too.
Okay. But I was curious, because you said it's a semester-long project. What's the rest of the assignments in the class? Is this the only project, or like, how do you balance that with a final or a midterm, or just kind of in terms of the workload? What have you found? Is something else needed, or you feel like this is good enough because you have all these parts and it kind of does all the work you need it to do?
Okay, thank you. Well, I have done this both on a semester and on a quarter. Now, it is fast on a quarter. It is not easy, but it is still just as rewarding. And these are the only projects that I use. So the interview, the cultural commentary review, they have an essay related to the class, they have the art piece, right? And they have the personal reflection. And that all has to come together in the zine. So their final is the zine part.
Okay.
Right? So everything else is just, okay, your first assignment, I've done this on a quarter. First assignments due week 3, week 6, we're going quickly, but I do think that it allows the space for that being the main focus. And I thought about balancing out with exams, but it just feels like too much to do an exam and expect so much writing, and also, I hope that I catch some mistakes or spellings or things so that they can actually improve their project. So it's kind of fast turnover. So I just stick with this. That final it's weighted a little bit heavier, but the final is just the actual collaboration of the zine and the zine share. I make it really central that they have to participate in reviewing their colleagues' work, or whatever way you want to think about reviewing, sharing, enjoying, right? Enjoying what their colleagues have produced. Because I didn't tell them they all had to write a paper on X, that means every single zine they get, everything's going to be new to them. Every interview, every cultural commentary. So then that growth, it goes exponentially, where it's like 100 different films were reviewed.
Can I follow up just really quickly? So are you giving, like, let's say they do the first part, the first assignment, the commentary, and they're handing it in. Are you like giving them feedback, but you're not, and then the idea is when they hand the final, they should have probably corrected that, or it should be more of a finished product?
Yeah. I mean, Ideally, it should be more of a finished project. Now, I try to give them some feedback so that they can make, revisions, but I don't say that they have to make a revision on the final. I suggest that they do, because I'm turning them over really quickly so that they can especially fix glaring missing things, So it is that quick turnover. But Jess, I'm not sure if I answered the rest of your question.
I think so. Just the idea of you're grading them as kind of individual assignments.
Exactly.
But then you're also giving kind of that, kind of marking it up. So when they handed that, because I'm thinking, like you say, they compile it all for the final project.
Exactly.
So what would be different from what you're seeing in the final project versus what you graded?
Okay, good question. So what I'm seeing for each assignment is really they're turning in separate papers. I'm seeing it looks like a regular, white paper, so there's nothing really as we go that's particularly creative about it as the assignments go. So the creative piece, the art piece, the color piece, you know, that comes in the last project. And what I expect from them is compiling the zine. They have to have the art piece in there, and they have to have that personal reflection. Those are the only things I haven't seen by then, right?
Okay.
I haven't seen what they got out of the class, right? Their art and the final zine. And I have wavered between how many zines I've had the students actually produce, you know, because it is challenging, you know. But if I'm working with a librarian, always fingers crossed if that's the case, they have to have a copy for themselves, for their own portfolio. Because I tell them, you know, you go into the next thing, you've got a book. Whatever you've done, you've already written a book, and that needs to belong in your portfolio. So they have to make a copy for me, a copy for themselves, right? A copy for the library, right? And I try to get them, and sometimes I already do, to have a copy just to exchange. So that in that last project, it's not just them giving feedback, but they can actually get someone else's zines to take with them. So I've done different styles like that, but I'm happy to share any of that with you.
Excellent. Great work. Really, really.
Any other questions? Ms. Hardy?
I would like to thank all three of you for this magnificent presentation and the abundance food for thought and how we can you know, help our students. Melissa Kazi, what a magnificent assignment. Your students remember this all their lives. They're never going to remember what they took on my cultural final, but they will remember your project forever. And in doing so, you really teach them, and they integrate everything you have to present in your class. I'm so impressed. It makes me so happy because oh good, I'm going to incorporate some of this, and it will make me a better teacher too. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you
I'm
for
really
saying
interested
that.
in, I had to come and go, but I'm really interested in specifically what was your assignment? How did you phrase it? I got letter with your components of it, but I just think it's magnificent.
Oh, well, I'm absolutely happy to share what I have with anybody here. I really, the thing about zines is I didn't make this up, right? I myself was always intrigued by this. I remember reading books as a young adolescent that focused on these things. I mean, around feminism and women of color. I mean, I was already interested in this as like a 13-year-old. So when I saw it as a space, you know, when I became a teacher, it just seemed like a logical connection of using my like punk rock affinities with my teaching, you know, like how do we make this work so that it has an effect on, like, I remember, I don't know if y'all had Dr. Audrey McCluskey at Indiana University. I will never forget her because she allowed us to do a project, and then I made a short film. I could have written a paper. It would have been a lot faster, I tell you that much. But I made a short film and I never forgot it. It was like 5 minutes. That was hard. Editing, I mean, it was just, but it was life-changing, and I wanted the students to have an opportunity to have something like that. Some of them might still be making zines to this day, and if not, they have that thing that they did that one time, and they know they can do it again if they want to. And that's enough for me.